Assessment of buildings and constructions. The assignment of buildings and constructions either to the farm or to one of the other components of a farming system is, at least in developed countries, usually unambiguous. Competition for these resources within a farming system is therefore rare, but can still occur with certain buildings, such as garages. However, the assignment of buildings and structures in other regions may not be so clear. In this case, for example, the traditional building was difficult to classify. It served as a shelter for animals but was also used as guest accommodation and for social gatherings. Similar difficulties with the assignment existed in this case, where the roof of the residential building was used simultaneously as a drying facility for agricultural products. Classification of buildings and constructions. The criteria that influence the evaluation and assessment of buildings and constructions can be divided into three categories: their assignment to the components of a farming system, their condition and equipment, and their duration of use. The assignment of buildings and structures to the components of a farming system serves to determine the partial analysis in which they are considered. Stables, barns, and silos fall under the farm category, while residential buildings are part of the household analysis. Storage rooms are, at least in purely market-oriented farming systems, usually farm buildings. However, in farming systems that also produce for subsistence consumption, this can overlap with the storage of household products. The same applies to workshops and greenhouses. Constructions can also be part of both sub-areas. For example, a milking parlor can be clearly assigned to the agricultural operation. The assignment is less clear in the case of a biogas plant, which may supply electricity and heat for farming purposes as well as for the household. Other constructions to consider in the resource analysis include pits, water reservoirs, roads, and yard areas, which may be relevant both in the partial analyses of the farm and the household and, where appropriate, in the examination of off-farm activities. A further criterion, or better, a group of criteria, for the distinction of buildings and constructions is their condition and equipment. This comprises aspects that may have an impact on the income and the living standard of the farm owners. This includes, for example, the status of repairs, the provision of connections for energy and water supply and other installations. Impacts on income may consist out of costs as well as out of opportunities for income-generating activities. Local standards for the equipment of residences are suitable as a reference for categorizing buildings and constructions in household analysis. Another distinguishing feature can be the duration for which buildings and facilities are used. This refers, for example, to the intervals during which available stable spaces are actually occupied or living spaces are used. Measurement of buildings and constructions. A basic measurement of capacities in the different categories of buildings and constructions is their recording in units of area and volume. However, measurement in functional units may be better suited for analytical purposes. For example, stable spaces for specific type of livestock are adequate for measuring stable buildings, the number of residential units for residential building, the output in watt or joule for biogas plants and the storage capacity of manure pits. The value of buildings and facilities for a farming system depends on their utility and impact on the four components of the system. By comparison, the market value of individual buildings and facilities is rarely relevant for the decisions of farm owners. Buildings and structures are usually located on the terrain of the farming system. Accordingly, there will be few potential buyers for a sale. For this reason, the market value is almost always below the construction costs immediately after completion. From the perspective of agricultural economics, the proper valuation of buildings and facilities is therefore based on their utility value or, more precisely, on their income value. The income value is the capitalized earnings value that results from the production processes enabled by the constructions minus the costs for their operation and maintenance. The income value also includes additional benefits from performance improvements and possible cost savings. Buildings increase the durability of machinery and equipment by protecting them from the elements. Buildings can improve livestock performance, for example, through air conditioning. In buildings, work processes can be better organized and thus made more effective and efficient. Storage facilities reduce losses and lower associated costs. The determination of the income value is the task of the partial analyses of the four components of farming systems. These values are the starting point for the assessment of buildings and facilities with regard to the decision-making behavior of farm owners. The income contribution increases the total annual income available and thus the basis for household provision and the living standard. The effects on liquidity can hardly be separated according to the four components, at least in family-run farming systems. Buildings and facilities are investments to which farmers commit themselves for several years. The most important financial decisions are made before construction begins, and a short-term termination of the commitments is hardly possible. Cash inflows and outflows caused by buildings and structures cannot be considered in isolation, but rather require consideration in the context of the claims and contributions of all other system components. The high initial depreciation of agricultural buildings limits the option of easing temporary liquidity bottlenecks through loans, for which such buildings could serve as collateral. Consequently, buildings and constructions increase the financial uncertainty of a farming system due to the tied-up financial capacity and the simultaneous increase in fixed costs for maintenance and, if applicable, loan repayment. In household supply, buildings contribute to the satisfaction of housing needs. Competition with the agricultural operation essentially exists in the distribution of the total available liquidity. However, especially in farming systems that are heavily dependent on self-sufficiency, competition can also arise for storage capacity for products for personal consumption on the one hand and for sale on the other.